the only reason why I like to pick on it is because, like, they're so sure of themselves, you know, like as if they have some ultimate truth. But then you, like, run into the guys and listen to the people that actually know what they're talking about, and they admit, like, yeah, we don't, like, we know a bunch, but we don't really know anything, you know, like,
yeah.
and so, but, like, what can the indigenous perspective provide, right? And this gets into, like, traditional knowledge and things like that. Like, traditional knowledge is super valuable, actually. Right, so this was a really great story that my friend told me about when I think this happened in Russia, right? And that they were looking for gold, and that, like, the gold miner dude, like, literally just went to the indigenous people and he showed them these rocks, and he said, "These are the kind of rocks that I'm looking for. Where are they?" And they told him where they were. "Oh, those kind of rocks. Oh, those are over there, right?" And so and it completely cut, like, all this stuff you would have had to do, but the guy was smart enough to know to trust local indigenous knowledge, right? You know, and it's more than just simple like that, right? Like, how do you understand the universe? How do you understand yourself, right? Like, and these are important questions. Like, this is why people suffer from what's the word? That existential angst. Who has those answers? I mean, there's people that believe that they have the answers, right? But do you know anybody who does, other than me? And I have really high aspirations for a lot of the things that I'm doing, and I'm challenging, like, Western ideas at a really fundamental level, and really hoping that I'll be successful, because I don't see a lot of, like, who are our heroes, man? You know, like,
who are our heroes? You mean, like, as
collectively? Yeah. Like who do we look to, right? You know, and
I have that.
No.
Do you think Yupik is part of the Inuit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So, I mean, I definitely see how they're different, and I understand all that. But again, when you come from a northern philosophical perspective, you don't focus on, but you see how things are more, like, Yupiks and Inupiaks are more same than different, right?
I agree.
And, like, the ways in which we are different are important, but more same than different. You know, even the languages have the same root language, right? And I don't think that we can really deny the relationship that exists there, but also recognizing that we are different, right?
I asked Warren how and why he got interested in this idea of Northern philosophy.
I mean, it really did just come from, like, a really powerful need to make sense of the world around me, right? Like, because it wasn't making sense. None of it was, right? All the questions that I asked ended at a dead end, right? Like, so, I mean, I will talk about it, right? So, like, really, like, how all this stuff started was my brother killing himself, right? Like, it was just such a traumatic event that, like, it made me question everything. You know, like, what am I doing with my life? What kinds of things are important? Like, is anything that we're doing, like, addressing this problem of suicide and blah, 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 right? And I couldn't make any sense of the world around me, right? Like the things that we're doing, you know, I'm like, how is this going to help? What is this? Why are we doing this, right? And nobody could give me a clear path about where we were going and what we were doing, right? And there was all these things that I thought were true and decided, and then I find out that, no, we actually don't know a bunch of this stuff, right? And so, like, and it was really weird because it was my escape from grief to study physics, right? And because, like, all I could think about was the suicide, right? Like, so he killed himself, and then it took, like, 3 days for me to scrape his brains and shit off the walls, right? And all that time was just nothing but time to think and to stew and to try to make sense of the things that were happening, right? And, like, when I tell people that, like, I really feel like I don't think I ever left that room, right? Like, I'm pretty sure the person that walked in never walked out, right? And that, like, whoever the fuck I am now is that thing that walked out of there, you know? Nothing made sense, so I started looking at and studying physics, right? Like, I tried to, like, throw myself back into my work, my philosophical work. What I was actually working on was literally an ethics for atheists, right? So I used to be, like, a really, really hardcore atheist, right? And, like to the point where I would bully Christians for their, what I perceived to be their ignorant beliefs and all these sorts of things, right? So I was working on this kind of, like, this moral, like a ethics, a morality for atheists, kind of, like, based off, like, indigenous cultures, right? And so I wanted to, like, kind of model it off of the universe. And the reason being is that, like, complex systems theory was another area of study for me. And in complex systems theory, you know, it's like this idea that, like, you have these really incredibly complex structures and complex things coming from very simple fundamental rules, right? So I was going like, hey, like we could probably have a moral, like ethical system that only has very few rules that's capable of handling like a really complex landscape, right? Mm-hmm. So I start delving myself into physics as an escape from grief, right? Now, the first thing I find out is that we don't really know what time is, right? And I'm going like, wait, what do you mean we don't know what time is, right? You know, and I'm like listening to these lectures and like reading this because I'm going like, wait a minute, I know what time is, you know, and then only to find out, well, maybe I don't know what time is, right? You know, and I mean, you're talking about like shaking your fundamental beliefs about the world when I was already in a place of like, I was not good. Everybody knew it. I was not good. Like all day long, just crying and just in this. But I thought it was okay, you know. So then I find out, of course, next that we don't know what gravity is, right? You know, and then like so there's all this stuff that I thought was sure and decided, right? And it extends from more than just that. It's to like everything, right? Like nothing is super well defined, but yet everybody's walking around like we know what the fuck we're doing and like we know what the fuck we're talking about, right? But none of it was good enough for me because I'm like, no. There's holes in all this, right? So I needed something. Like I needed to create a framework for understanding the world, and the old one wasn't good enough, right? So I kind of had to create something new old, you know? And studying culture was part of that because I needed to know this thing. You know, like my need for like making sense of the world around me, it was a matter of life and death, right? And that's what I was talking about earlier when my identity was the only thing that held me in place, right? The reason why it was a matter of life and death was because nothing made any sense to me. Right? And when nothing makes any sense to you, that's not a good place to be. That's a dangerous place. And I think that a lot of us are in it, right? This is like why I think dudes shoot up schools and shit, and everybody's killing themselves all the time, right? Because nobody knows what's going on. Yeah. Nobody has any good answers. There's no good solutions. And all the shit that everybody tells you is they're all full of shit, and we know it, but like we just buy into it because what else are you going to do, huh?
Somebody has to believe in something.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, you can live a life without thinking about it. You can live an unexamined life. Like I said, the reason why this was important to me was for me. Like I needed to understand the world better. And the framework that I had been provided wasn't doing it. There was too many holes in it. You know, and this is like, I feel like this is how it's been from the start. Like I was not good in school. I didn't do well because I just didn't, it's like, this is dumb. I don't see the point of this. I don't understand this. You know, like this is, none of this stuff has any bearing on me, you know, and what I'm doing. And like, I think that where we're at right now is that a lot of our people don't have the space to question these sorts of things, you know, like, when me and Arlo were having a discussion a long time ago, you know, and this comes from my own personal experience, right? Like I'm not pushing this on other poor people or whatever, because I'm not currently poor, but I grew up poor, and I remember being poor. And when you're poor, you think about poor people. Mm-hmm. You're not thinking about fucking astrophysics. You're not worrying about the nature of reality. You know, you're worried about much more immediate usually, you know, and especially our people that are experiencing trauma and things like that, they don't have the room to sit there and think about these questions, right? Mm-hmm. And we want to get them out of that place. You know, and I mean, this is why, like, when we have a lot of conversations we have about sovereignty, they're kind of missing the point, right? Like, we're not ready for it yet. You know, when you remember Maslow's hierarchy from school, mm-hmm. right? Like, okay, so, yep, right. Now, of course, it's very Western in its execution, right? Being a hierarchy and being a triangle instead of being a circle and instead of, like, you know, recognizing these sorts of things. But the point is valid, right? You know, that there is a process, that you need these things if you're going to have this thing. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to have sovereignty, we sure as fuck ain't going to start with at the top, right? Okay, maybe that might work. I could see it. But it's like getting your people out of that place where they can start worrying about this stuff on their own, mm-hmm. right? You know, like this idea behind the Men's House and why it's part of the Salmon Fellows is that the idea is that if you want more indigenous participation in government, mm-hmm. then we need to get the indigenous people out of the place where they're at, so that way they can have the
time and space.
The time and space to do these things, because there are people that want to do these things. There are people that have aspirations. There are other astrophysicists. There are other philosophers out there, but they don't have the room or the space to do this, and we need to find some way to give it to them, right? This is the point of a society. This is the point of our culture, right? It's like, and we're not doing it, and we can point fingers all we want, and I get it. It's not our fault. We didn't do it to ourselves, right? And there are people that are already in our way. They're actively fighting us. But that still doesn't give us an excuse, because we're the only ones that can do it. We're the only ones that understand the things that need to be done, right? You could try to get a white person to restore the kazgig, right? But it wouldn't be right, because they don't understand it fundamentally, right?
What is the importance of the kazgig?
So the importance of it was probably more functional than spiritual, right? So like the kazgig was like part of yuuyaraq, right? Like it's part of the structure that existed. So this was the institution. You can think of it not as a building, but as an institution, and it was part of the governance structure of the community. So the men's house was like the most important aspect of it, like the most important characteristic, like the defining characteristic of a community, right? So if a place didn't have one, then it wasn't recognized as a community, right? That quote comes from Frank, can't remember his name, but he's from Kwingalock. I'm saying that name. Yeah. Anyway, the whole point, though, is that like this thing was super important, right? And what role did it serve? Social, economic, spiritual, and political, yes, right? And it served all those roles, which makes total sense given the size of our communities back then, right? Like you would have smaller institutions to serve these things, and they would serve multiple roles, right? So, but this institution was the place where the decisions were made. This is the place where community events happened. This is the place where, most importantly, that young men were taught how to be men, right? Mm-hmm. This is a great segue, because this is another good example of how cultural differences can have huge impacts on your society, right? Mm-hmm. So the tenets of Yupik masculinity, as I've identified them, right? And again, for anybody listening, if you want to challenge this, go right ahead, But is awareness, reason, and self-control, right? And I consider those things in particular. I think awareness is important for everybody, but it's especially important for you to have as a man, right? When we talk about like differences between men and women, there are some of them that are real obvious, like differences in strength and things like that, right? And that's actually one of the things that you have to be aware of as a man, right? Like of your own strength, and especially if you're a big man, you really have to be aware of yourself and how you present and you hold yourself in this world, right? So like awareness, it's so important for everybody, but especially important for men for lots of reasons, right? Yeah. Reason, for me, the way that I define it is kind of like, it's sort of like logic, right? Like how do you logic stuff out, right? How do you reason, right? And this was important in the traditional context, because it's like you're teaching people how to, like, okay, if you do this, then what's going to happen, right? If you do this, then what are the potential things that could happen, right? And this is the process of reasoning. And you teach them that so that way they can reason out, like, it's like, okay, so we know that spring is coming, and we know that last year was a good run of fish, and this year's not going to be that good. Like, so it's like this kind of process of reasoning, which is super important, right? And I do think that reasoning is something that's super important for a young man to learn, right? Like, how do you reason shit out, right? So you can understand the decisions that you make, right? You couple that with awareness, and it's a really powerful combination, right? And then the last one is self-control, and again, I think this is something that's really important, especially for a young man to learn, right? Like when I tell people what I remember about being like 17 years old is that I was basically like a walking erection. Like, and your brain does short circuit. I'm serious. Like, I'm just saying that your shit don't work right. It works differently, especially when you're aroused or whatever you want to say here, right? And so it's like teaching young men how to have control even then, right? Or another good example is when you're just raging pissed. How do you have control then? How do you get control of yourself, right? Yeah. If you have self-control, you never get to that place, right? But because once you get to that place, it's hard to get out of. Yeah, right? And like, how do you calm down from there? And so the best thing is to just not get there in the first place. This is what self-control is about, right? Which I like to clarify and say that this doesn't mean that you don't have emotions, and this doesn't mean that you suppress the emotions, right? You have them. You just learn how to control them when you have them. you know, but you got to let them happen, right? Because they're happening for a reason. There's something going on that you know, so it's like my kids. It's like when they see me, you know, like most of the time it just looks like I'm having nothing, but it's not. I'm pissed, you know, or I'm sad or whatever, right? But it's like, but it's not the appropriate time for me to